The moment the pilot walked out of the cockpit and into the first-class cabin, the entire plane went silent. Not the polite quiet of people minding their business at 30,000 feet. The absolute silence of 63 people who had been watching something unfold for the past 14 minutes and had not said enough and knew it, and who now sat very still because a man in a white uniform with 4 gold stripes on his sleeve was standing in the aisle looking at something that had made his face change in a way that faces change when a person of authority sees an injustice and decides that authority exists precisely for moments like this one. I want to start there, at that silence. Because that silence contained everything. It contained the 14 minutes that preceded it, and the years that preceded those minutes, and the specific cruelty of a world that looks at an old woman with a single suitcase and a window seat confirmation, and decides she does not belong in the space she paid for and earned, and has every right to occupy. That silence was the sound of a plane full of people being shown something about themselves and having no more words for it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me take you back to the departure gate at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport on a Thursday morning in March, because the beginning of this story is important, and it is where the love is, and the love is what makes everything else matter. Her name was Estelle Mee Johnson. She was 78 years old. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall, and she carried herself with the specific upright posture of a woman who had been told her whole life that she needed to make herself smaller, and had decided at some point, decades ago, that she would not. She wore a lavender cardigan over a white blouse with a small brooch at the collar, a cameo that had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before that. 3 generations of women carried in a piece of jewelry at the throat of a woman traveling alone. Her hair was silver and neat, and her hands, when she held her boarding pass, were the hands of someone who had worked with them for many years and wore that work as evidence of a life fully lived. I know all of this because I was sitting 3 rows behind her when she boarded. I had watched her come down the jetway with the careful, deliberate pace of a woman who has learned that haste at her age produces consequences, holding her boarding pass and her small personal item, a canvas tote bag with a sunflower printed on it that looked handmade, and I had watched her find her seat, 3A, window, first class, with the quiet satisfaction of someone settling into something they have been looking forward to. My name is Patricia Monroe. I am 51 years old, a high school principal from Atlanta, Georgia, and I was on that flight to Los Angeles because my daughter had just had her first baby, and I was going to meet my grandchild for the first time, which is the kind of reason that makes every inconvenience of air travel feel manageable, and every moment of waiting feel charged with the specific impatience of joy. I was in seat 6C. I could see the first-class cabin clearly from where I sat. In that in-between zone of premium economy, where you are close enough to see first class and far enough that it reminds you exactly where you are. I watched Estelle settle into 3A. I watched her tuck her tote bag under the seat in front of her with the careful economy of a woman who has been traveling for decades and knows exactly how much space she has and exactly how to use it. I watched her look out the window at the tarmac, with an expression that I recognized as the expression of someone who is going somewhere that matters and is allowing themselves to feel the full weight of going there. The flight attendant who approached her appeared approximately 5 minutes after she sat down. Young, polished, the professional warmth of someone trained to make people comfortable suddenly deployed in the opposite direction. She crouched beside Estelle's seat and spoke in the low voice that people use when they want to say something privately in a public space, which is to say a voice just loud enough for the 3 surrounding rows to hear without technically being addressed. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough. I heard the words boarding pass and verification, and there may have been an error. I watched Estelle's face, which had been peaceful a moment before, shift into the careful, neutral expression of a woman who has been in this specific position before, who has had her presence in spaces questioned before, who has learned that the expression you wear in these moments matters, because it will be used as evidence for whatever the other person has already decided. Estelle opened her tote bag. She produced her boarding pass. She handed it to the flight attendant with the quiet dignity of someone who knows she is right and is presenting the evidence of being right with the same composure she would bring to any other transaction. The flight attendant examined it. Then, she made a brief radio call on the small communication device on her shoulder. Then another flight attendant appeared. I want to tell you about the second flight attendant because she is important to this story, and because I want to be accurate about what I observed. She was older than the first, more senior in the way that is visible in how someone carries their authority. And when she arrived at 3A, she brought with her the specific energy of someone who has been called to resolve a situation and has already decided, before fully examining the situation, what resolution looks like. She spoke more clearly than the first attendant, which is how I heard the words I am going to tell you she said. She said there had been a system issue, and this seat had been double booked, and they were going to need Estelle to come with her to sort it out at the front. She said it with the specific professional smoothness of someone who has delivered this particular kind of managed untruth before, with the tone that says this is a procedure, not a judgment, while everything in the body language says something else entirely. Estelle looked at her. She did not immediately stand. She said, calmly and clearly, that she had purchased this seat 4 weeks ago and that her boarding pass said 3A and that she was in 3A. She said this without aggression, without raised volume, with the specific quiet authority of a woman who knows what she bought and is stating a fact. The flight attendant said again that there had been a situation and that she needed to come to the front. I looked around the first-class cabin. All 11 other seats were occupied. Several passengers were looking at their phones or their tablets. 2 were watching. None were speaking. Estelle said she would appreciate it if they could resolve the situation at her seat rather than asking her to move, as she had a boarding pass for this specific seat and had not done anything that required her to leave it. The second flight attendant said, in a voice that had shifted from smooth to firm, that she was going to need her to come now. Something happened in Estelle's face at the word now. Not defeat. Not capitulation. Something more complicated than that, the specific expression of a woman who is performing a calculation in real time, calculating the cost of the resistance against the cost of the compliance, calculating what she has the energy for and what she does not, calculating the 11 pairs of eyes in the first-class cabin and whether any of them are going to say anything, calculating the years and the years and the years of this specific calculation. She stood up. She took her tote bag. She moved into the aisle with the careful dignity she had maintained the whole time, spine straight, head level, cameo at her throat. And she walked toward the back of the plane. I am going to pause here because I need to tell you that in the moment she stood up and walked, I felt something in my chest that I want to describe accurately. It was not just sympathy. It was the specific recognition of a woman who has watched this happen to women who look like her, and to women who look like Estelle for her entire life. It was the recognition of an injustice that presents itself as procedure, of a wrong that has been made to wear the costume of policy, and the specific nausea of watching it happen in real time while 60 people around you sit with their tablets and their coffees and do not speak. I should have spoken. I want to say that clearly and first. I should have stood up the moment the first flight attendant crouched beside that seat, and I should have said something. I did not. I sat in my 6C, and I watched, and I told myself I did not have all the information, and I told myself it was being handled, and I sat in the specific cowardice of a bystander who has dressed her inaction in the clothes of uncertainty. Estelle was directed to a middle seat in row 27. The flight attendant handed her a new boarding pass. She took it without visible reaction. She sat down in the middle seat between a young man wearing headphones who did not look up and an older woman who glanced at her once and looked away. I watched all of this from my seat. And then I did something I had not done in the first 14 minutes of this situation. I pressed my call button. The first flight attendant appeared. I said I would like to understand what had happened to the passenger in 3A. She said there had been a booking issue, and it had been resolved. I said I had watched the passenger produce a valid boarding pass for 3A, and had not seen any other passenger produce a competing claim for that seat. And I asked who was currently sitting in 3A. She said the seat had been needed for an operational reason, and the matter had been resolved. She said it with the specific practiced brevity of someone ending a conversation rather than having one. She moved away. I sat with that for a moment. Then I got up. I walked to the front of the plane. The gate agent was still at the door. I told him I was a passenger with a concern, and I wanted to speak with the senior cabin crew member before departure. He looked at me with the expression of someone who deals with passenger concerns approximately 40 times per day, and said the crew was preparing for departure, and he would pass along my concern. I told him that I had watched a first-class passenger with a valid boarding pass for seat 3A be asked to move without a clear explanation and relocated to economy, and I wanted to understand the operational reason before we departed because it was my strong impression that no such reason existed. Something shifted in the gate agent's expression. Not guilt exactly. More the expression of someone who has just been put on record about something they would prefer not to be on record about. I went back to my seat. What happened next is what I am going to tell you about now, and it is the part of the story that has stayed with me most completely in the months since it happened, because it arrived from a direction none of us were looking. The cockpit door opened. The pilot who came out was a black man in his 50s, tall, gray at his temples, 4 gold stripes on his white uniform sleeve. He stood in the aisle of the first-class cabin and he looked at the seat. He looked at 3A, which now contained a white man in his 40s in a business suit who had boarded approximately 8 minutes after Estelle had been removed. Then he looked toward the back of the plane with an expression I could see from row 6, and which I will try to describe as accurately as I can. It was not anger. Anger would have been simpler and easier to dismiss. It was something older and more complete than anger. It was the expression of a man who has spent 30 years in an industry that has made him familiar with a specific variety of what is happening in this cabin right now, and who has walked out of his cockpit because he has decided that the authority he carries exists for exactly this kind of moment. He walked down the aisle. He walked past first class. He walked past premium economy. He walked to row 27. He stopped beside Estelle's row. He looked at her. She looked up at him. And what happened in that look was something I could see from where I sat and that I will tell you about as truthfully as I can, which is that 2 people recognized something in each other, some shared understanding of a long history and of this specific moment within it, and that recognition was both painful and sustaining simultaneously. He said, clearly enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "Ma'am, what seat were you assigned when you boarded?" Estelle said. 3A, he said. "Do you still have your original boarding pass?" She reached into her tote bag. She produced it. She handed it to him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up, and he looked at the flight attendant who had relocated Estelle, who was standing at the front of the cabin watching this, with the expression of someone watching a situation move outside the territory they control. He said, and this is the part that silenced the plane, this is the part that made 63 people stop their scrolling and their typing and their earbudded isolation and become, suddenly and completely, an audience. He said the following in a voice that was not raised and did not need to be because it contained 30 years of what it contained, and it traveled the length of that cabin without effort. He said, "This passenger has a valid boarding pass for seat 3A in first class, which she purchased and paid for. She was removed from that seat after boarding and relocated to economy without her consent and without a legitimate operational reason. I am the captain of this aircraft. This aircraft does not depart until this passenger is returned to her purchased seat." The silence that followed was the silence I described at the beginning of this story. The silence of 63 people and their tablets and their coffees and their carefully maintained not noticing, all of it suspended. Nobody moved for a moment. Then the senior flight attendant walked down the aisle. She spoke briefly to the man in 3A. He looked at her. He looked at his seat. He looked at the captain. Then he gathered his jacket and his bag and he stood up and he moved. He did not move to 27. He was relocated to a different seat in first class that had apparently been available this entire time. The captain walked back up the aisle beside Estelle. He carried her tote bag. She walked beside him with her spine straight and her head level and her cameo at her throat. He placed the tote bag in the overhead bin above 3A. He gestured to the window seat. Estelle sat down. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she looked up at him. She said, very quietly, "Thank you." He said, "You're exactly where you belong." Then he went back into his cockpit and the door closed. Nobody in the cabin spoke for a long time. Not the performative silence of people pretending not to have seen something. The different silence of people sitting with what they had seen and what it was asking of them. I want to tell you what happened during the rest of that flight, because the story does not end at that moment, even though the moment was the thing everyone on the plane would remember. I want to tell you what happened at cruising altitude when the flight attendant service began, and I walked to row 27 to find the woman who should not have been there, and was there for approximately 20 minutes because of the specific cruelty of a world that looks at 78 years and a lavender cardigan and a handmade tote bag, and decides it does not belong in first class. I found her on my way to the bathroom, or rather I found myself stopping beside her row and crouching down the way the first flight attendant had crouched beside 3A, but for a different reason. I said I was sorry I had not said something sooner. I said I had watched what happened and I had not done enough quickly enough, and I was sorry. She looked at me. Her expression was not resentment, and it was not the performed forgiveness of a woman performing grace for an audience. It was something more direct than either of those things. She said she appreciated me saying so. She said it had been a long time since she had been surprised by these things, but that being unsurprised did not make them smaller. I asked her where she was going. She said she was going to Los Angeles. She said her son was a pilot and she was going to visit him, and that she had saved for 6 months to fly first class because she had never done it and she was 78 years old, and she had decided that she had waited long enough. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, quietly and with the specific feeling of someone fitting a piece into a place it belongs, "Is your son the captain of this flight?" She looked at me. Her expression shifted into something I did not have a word for immediately, something that contained both pride and the specific emotion of a mother watching her child do something that makes her feel that whatever she sacrificed to raise him was worth every cost. She said, "He is." I thought about the captain walking out of his cockpit. I thought about the look that had passed between them in row 27. I understood that look differently now. I understood it was not only the recognition of two people with a shared history. It was the recognition of a son and his mother. It was a man who had been told by someone at 30,000 feet that his mother was sitting in row 27 when her boarding pass said 3A, who had walked out of his cockpit because there was no version of his authority that would allow him to sit behind a closed door while that was happening. I went back to my seat. I sat with everything I was feeling, which was too large for the seat and too large for the altitude and honestly too large for the rest of the flight. I thought about my own mother, who had died 4 years earlier, and about the things I had and had not done for her in the years before that. I thought about the specific love of a son who has not forgotten who built him. I landed in Los Angeles, and I met my granddaughter for the first time, a 7-pound person named Elise who looked at me with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to trust the world. And I held her, and I cried the way you cry when something new begins and something old is honored at the same time. Before I left the gate, I waited near the jetway. The captain came through about 15 minutes after the passengers had deplaned. He was walking with Estelle beside him, her tote bag over his shoulder, his hand at her elbow with the specific attentiveness of a son who knows his mother takes her time on uneven surfaces and does not want to rush her. I did not approach them. That moment was not mine. I watched them walk through the terminal together, the captain in his white uniform and his mother in her lavender cardigan with the cameo at her throat, and I thought about what it had taken to make that walk possible. What he had built over 30 years. What she had given him to build it with. What it meant that he had used what he built the way he used it on that plane. I want to tell you what I have thought about since that day, because I think the lesson of that flight is not simply the lesson of one man using his authority correctly, though that is part of it. The deeper lesson is something about what we build authority for. About what it means to work for 30 years towards something and then to use that thing, in the moment it is most needed, not to protect your comfort or your convenience, but to protect someone who cannot protect themselves in that room. There is a version of power that is accumulated and held and displayed and used to maintain the status of the person who holds it. And there is a version of power that is accumulated and held and then, in the right moment, spent. Spent completely and without hesitation in the service of something that matters more than the power itself. That captain spent his power in row 27. He spent it on his mother, but also on everyone who has ever been told, in the specific polished language of procedure, that they do not belong in the seat they purchased. He spent it on everyone who has ever done the calculation of resistance versus compliance and felt the weight of that calculation in their body. He spent it on everyone who has ever been moved from a window seat to a middle seat in the specific bureaucratic language of an operational reason that does not exist. He spent it. And in spending it, he was more powerful than he had been when he was sitting behind the closed cockpit door with his 4 gold stripes and his authority intact and unused. I have thought about the 14 minutes, about the 11 passengers in first class who did not speak, about myself in 6C who took too long to press the call button, about the specific mechanics of bystander silence, how it works, how it is maintained, how the first person who says something changes the temperature of a room, and how the absence of that first person maintains a temperature that nobody would choose if they were asked directly. I have thought about Estelle's face when she stood up to go to row 27. About the calculation I could see her running. About the specific exhaustion of a 78-year-old woman who has run that calculation more times than I have run it, which is more times than I want to count. Who knows the cost of the resistance and the different cost of the compliance, and who sometimes, on a Thursday morning, when she has been saving for 6 months to do something she has never done, chooses the compliance because she does not have the energy for the alternative. I have thought about what it would mean to change that calculation. Not for individuals managing individual confrontations, but systemically. to change what the default costs, to make the silence cost more than the speaking, to make the standing up and saying something the easier choice rather than the harder one. I have not solved that. I do not have the answer. But I have the question more clearly than I had it before I got on that plane, and I think that having the question clearly is the first step toward the answer. And I think that Estelle and her son, and the 14 minutes, and the silence that fell when the captain walked back up that aisle are going to stay with me as long as I have questions to ask about what kind of person I want to be, and what it costs to be that person, and whether that cost is worth it. It is. That is my conclusion. It is worth it. The cost of speaking is always less than the cost of watching. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt true or felt like something that needed to be said, I want you to do one thing right now. Subscribe to Black Diamonds and hit that notification bell. Because this channel exists for stories exactly like this one. Stories about dignity and authority and the specific courage of a man who walked out of his cockpit. Stories about what power is for and who it belongs to and what happens when someone uses it the way it was meant to be used. You do not want to miss what is coming next. And right now in the comments, I want your name and your city. Just those two things. Because this story reached people in ways I could not have predicted, and the people it reached are everywhere and every single one of them deserves to be counted. Drop your name and your city right now. I read every single comment. My name is Patricia. I am telling you this story from Atlanta, Georgia, where I am a high school principal who is trying every day to teach young people that the first person to speak is not necessarily the loudest or the most powerful person in the room. They are the most important one. Elise is 7 months old now. She is learning to sit up on her own. She has her great-grandmother's eyes on her mother's side, and she looks at everything with the specific focused attention of someone who has decided that the world is interesting and worth examining carefully. I hope she never has to run that calculation. I hope by the time she is old enough to board a plane alone, we have built something different enough that the calculation is not the one Estelle ran on that Thursday morning. But if she does have to run it, I hope someone presses their call button faster than I pressed mine. And I hope, somewhere on that plane, there is someone walking out of a cockpit. Next week on Black Diamonds, I am going to tell you about a woman who was told at a hospital that she did not have insurance when she did, who spent 3 hours in a waiting room while her condition worsened, and who discovered that the person who had denied her coverage had made that decision based on something that had nothing to do with her policy. What the hospital administrator found when she looked at the file. What the woman said when she was finally seen. And what happened when the story reached the people it needed to reach. Subscribe right now. Turn on your notifications. I will see you next week. Seat 3A window, first class. She paid for it. She earned it. She belonged there. Some things are that simple.